There's a version of The Walking Dead that most people think they know. 11 seasons, 177 episodes, an unreasonable amount of Georgia mud, and a body count large enough to fill several very large fields. All of which is accurate. But the thing about this show, the thing I keep coming back to whenever I put it on late at night, is that the zombies are almost incidental. They're there, obviously. They're quite important to the forward momentum of the plot. But they're really just the pressure, the thing that makes the real story visible. The real story is about people. I know that sounds like something you'd put on a promotional poster, but sit with it for a moment. Because when you actually go back through 11 seasons of this show and look carefully at what it's doing with its characters, really look at it, what you find is a piece of television that is genuinely, almost unexpectedly honest about grief, about identity, about the distance between who you thought you were and who the situation you find yourself in requires you to become. About hope of the stubborn, unreasonable, deeply inconvenient kind. About what it costs a person to always be the one that everyone else needs. Tonight I want to walk through this world properly, not rushing, not summarizing, just going character by character through the lore, talking about what the show is actually doing with these people, and what, if you sit with it long enough, it quietly teaches you about being alive. Some of it is specific to surviving catastrophe. Most of it turns out to be surprisingly applicable to an ordinary life. Grief is grief. The mechanisms the show keeps returning to, identity, fear, attachment, the cost of staying, the cost of leaving, they don't require a zombie apocalypse to mean something. They just need enough pressure to make what was always true become finally visible. We'll talk about Rick Grimes waking up in that hospital and what it means to lose not just a situation, but the entire context that made your identity legible. We'll talk about Shane, who is a far more interesting character than he usually gets credit for. We'll talk about Daryl and Carol and Herschel and Michonne and Morgan and Negan and Beth and Carl and Maggie and the communities they all tried to build. Quite a lot of ground to cover, which makes it rather perfect for a long night. If you're watching to fall asleep, each section stands on its own. Drift off whenever. There's nothing you'll be missing. And if you're here because you love this show and you want company thinking about it at an unreasonable hour, equally welcome. Before we get into it, subscribing to the channel is completely free and genuinely does help more than you'd think. Right, let's go. We'll start where the show starts, with a man waking up alone. The first thing you need to know about Days Gone By, Season 1, Episode 1, is how quiet it is. No swelling score over a catastrophe. No survivors giving tearful testimony about what happened. Just a man walking down a deserted highway in a hospital gown, trying to work out what the world has become. The sequence inside that hospital is one of the best opening stretches of television I can think of. It earns every bit of its reputation. Rick wakes up in a room where the flowers by his bed have gone brown and brittle, where the IV drip has dried up, where the clock on the wall has stopped. He pulls himself out of bed and falls immediately to the floor, because weeks in a coma will do that to your legs. He drinks from the tap in the bathroom because he has nothing else. He stumbles into the hallway, dark and dishevelled and smelling wrong in a way the show conveys entirely through Rick's expressions, and finds, at the end of it, a cafeteria with its doors chained shut and the words, "Don't open dead inside," painted across them in urgent block letters, with grey hands reaching through the gap in the doors and grasping at nothing. What Rick does next is, I think, quietly instructive. He doesn't freeze there staring at the hands. He just processes it, files it under things I do not yet understand, and keeps walking. He finds a stairwell, lights a match, gets down to the loading bay, and emerges into daylight to find hundreds of wrapped bodies arranged in rows on the concrete. He takes this in, looks around, and then walks away from it because what else do you do? He finds a bicycle in a nearby park. A badly decomposed woman is lying beside it, and when he reaches for the bike, she turns and reaches for him, and he falls, scrambles back, gets on the bike and rides. He doesn't stop to understand what she is. He knows enough. He goes home. The house is empty. The photo albums are missing, which is how Rick knows his wife and son were there after whatever this is began. They took what mattered. He sits on the front steps for a moment. Then he sees a man stumbling down the road and waves at him, and a boy comes up behind him and hits him over the head with a shovel. This is Morgan Jones. And Morgan, once he has established that Rick isn't infected and isn't a threat, ties him to a bed in the neighbour's house and asks him careful, thorough questions. It's a remarkable first interaction in a new world. This stranger, who has every practical reason to leave Rick in the road, instead stops, assesses, and brings him somewhere safe. The caution is understandable. The kindness is not strictly necessary. Morgan does it anyway. There's a detail here worth pausing on. Rick wakes up, tied to a bed in an unfamiliar house, with an unfamiliar child standing guard over him, and his immediate response is to try to understand where he is and who these people are, rather than to panic. He gathers information. He asks questions. He tries to work out the logic of the situation before he reacts to it. This is already telling you something important about Rick Grimes, a habit of mind that will serve him well, and later cost him significantly. Morgan explains what he can. Rick goes home, showers, puts on clean clothes, and makes his way toward Atlanta on a horse, because he's heard a broadcast suggesting the city might still have some kind of emergency services, some kind of authority still functioning. He genuinely believes that if he can get to the city, there will be someone in charge, a system, a chain of command he can slot back into. He's wrong, of course. Atlanta's overrun. The horse is pulled down in an alley between two taxis, and Rick ends up sheltering inside a tank, with nothing but a dead soldier for company and the distant sound of a radio crackling. But here's the thing about that journey toward Atlanta. It isn't naive. Given what Rick knows at that point, it's the entirely reasonable thing to do. He is a sheriff's deputy. His whole adult life has been organised around the idea that authority exists, that systems function, that there are chains of command and procedures, and people whose job it is to manage catastrophes. Why would he assume those things have simply stopped? And that, I think, is the actual lesson in Rick's opening arc, which is quieter and stranger than it might first appear. It isn't a story about someone discovering an apocalypse. It's a story about someone discovering that the map they have been using to navigate their own identity no longer corresponds to the territory they're standing in. Rick knows who he is. He's a sheriff's deputy. He's Laurie's husband. He's Carl's father. He's Shane's partner. Every one of those identities is relational. It depends on a context that may or may not still exist, and he has no way of knowing which until he finds the people those roles were built around. Until he does, he is essentially just a man in a uniform walking through a world that has no more use for uniforms. This is worth sitting with, because most people know something like this feeling at some point. Maybe not the dramatic version of it, not waking up in an empty hospital to a changed world, but the quieter version that arrives when you leave a job that organised most of your time and your sense of purpose, or when a relationship that structured your days ends, or when you move somewhere new and none of the things that used to locate you in the world are present anymore. The context that held your identity together is gone, and in its place is just you, whatever that is, trying to find the rules of a world that looks superficially familiar but isn't quite working the way it's supposed to. Rick's answer in those first hours is movement. He keeps going, not because he knows where he's heading. The trip to Atlanta is not exactly a well-considered plan, but because staying still in an empty house with no information feels worse than moving towards something, even something uncertain. There's a useful instinct in that, I think. Paralysis in the absence of context is almost never actually helpful. The movement isn't optimism, it's just the one thing you can do. Glenn finds him in Atlanta, talks him out of the tank through the radio, through the streets, to where the rest of the group is sheltering. It's the beginning of one of the more unlikely and genuinely important friendships in the show. And then Rick gets to the quarry camp and finds Carl running across the open ground towards him, and Laurie turning and recognizing him, and the weight of everything the opening episode has established. The loss of context, the uncertainty, the disorientation of walking through a world that doesn't make sense anymore, lands differently in that moment. Not all of it comes back. The world is still the same broken place, but his son is there. His wife is there. Some of the people are there. And for Rick Grimes, people turn out to be the one map that still works. He leaves a radio with Morgan before he goes, promises to be on the agreed frequency at dawn. Morgan is listening, it turns out. He just can't answer yet. That detail, the radio transmission going out into uncertain distance, not knowing if it's getting through, doing it anyway, is one of those images the show uses as a kind of shorthand for the entire 11 seasons. You try to maintain connection across distances you can't see across. You do it anyway. That's pretty much all any of them are doing, the whole way through. One thing that stays consistent about Rick across the seasons that follow, because it connects directly to the person we meet in Days Gone By. He never fully lets go of the idea that there is a right way to do things, not a convenient way, not an efficient way, a right way. The rules he carried as a sheriff's deputy don't survive the apocalypse intact, but the instinct underneath them, the deep conviction that moral accounting matters even when nobody's checking, keeps reasserting itself. It's why the farm arc in Season 2 is so rich, Rick turning Herschel's land into something that functions with decency and with agreed-upon rules, trying to build a miniature version of the world he used to know. It's why Alexandria, when he gets there in Season 5, produces such a complex reaction in him. He can see what they've built, he can also see all the ways it could fail, and the tension between wanting the version of the world that Alexandria represents and not quite trusting that it can hold without the hard skills and the hard experiences his group carries. That tension drives most of his arc in Season 5 and 6. There's a specific quality Rick has that the show keeps returning to, which is the ability to wait. He doesn't always exercise it, and when he doesn't exercise it, the results are sometimes disastrous. But at his best, Rick watches a situation before acting in it. He gathers, he assesses, he finds the logic of a problem before he commits to a solution. This was what made him a good sheriff's deputy in the old world, and what makes him, in the new one, the kind of leader that people choose to follow rather than the kind they follow because there's no alternative. It also means that when Rick does move, when he stops watching and starts acting, it tends to be decisive in ways that can be alarming if you haven't been watching the assessment that preceded it. Watching Rick reach the end of his patience is genuinely one of the more compelling things the show does in its middle seasons. Shane Walsh is genuinely one of the most underrated characters in the whole show. I know that's a strong claim to make about a man who does some very bad things across 2 seasons, but hear me out, because I think what the show is doing with Shane is quite specific and quite telling. Here's what gets established early and quietly. Shane loved Laurie. Not in a convenient, plot-functional way, but properly, in a way that had reorganized something in him. He had worked alongside Rick for years. They were best friends in that very particular way that men who work dangerous jobs together tend to become best friends, built on trust and proximity, and the specific understanding that comes from being in high-stakes situations beside the same person over and over again. And when Rick was shot and left in a coma and the world fell apart around him, Shane made a decision that was, from where he was standing, entirely reasonable. He told Laurie that Rick was probably dead, and then he helped her and Carl survive. He didn't do that for ulterior motives. He did it because he genuinely believed Rick was gone, and he genuinely cared about Laurie and Carl's survival. The relationship that developed between him and Laurie during those weeks before Rick returned, that was real on his side. He wasn't taking advantage of a situation. He was trying to do the best version of himself inside an impossible one. There's a meaningful difference between those two things, and the show makes sure you understand it. And then Rick came back, and everything got complicated in a way that nobody had a map for. Here's the thing about Shane's arc that often gets missed. For quite a long stretch of it, he's right. Not always, and not in ways that excuse what comes later, but his read on the world they're living in is frequently more accurate than Rick's. He sees earlier than most that the quarry camp isn't sustainable. He understands instinctively that certain decisions will get people killed. The show does not let him be simply wrong in his assessments. His utility, cold and uncomfortable as it is, has real value. The problem isn't that Shane's logic is incorrect. It's that Shane starts using the correctness of his logic to justify things that go well beyond tactical necessity. And you can watch the line move in real time across seasons 1 and 2. There's a moment at the CDC, season 1's finale, TS19, when Jenna locks the doors and most of the group is prepared to accept the ending as something almost peaceful, and Shane gets them out. Not through persuasion, through breaking a window, through pure refusal to accept the comfortable conclusion. He's furious and frightened, and he forces everyone back towards survival, when survival is hard. That's Shane at his best. And then there's Otis. Otis, if you'll remember, is the man who accidentally shot Carl early in season 2. He and Shane go together to retrieve medical supplies from the local high school, supplies that Carl needs urgently. The run goes badly wrong. Walkers trap them both inside the building. They're running for their lives, and Otis is slower, considerably slower, and the walkers are gaining. And Shane makes a calculation. He shoots Otis in the leg. Not fatally, just enough to slow him down enough for the walkers to reach him first. Shane escapes with the supplies. He returns to the farm and tells everyone that Otis died heroically, getting what they needed, that he barely made it out himself. It's a lie that covers a murder, and the show presents it without any distance. You watch him do it. You watch him come back and construct the story. You watch him sit across from Otis's wife as she mourns a version of her husband that Shane invented. What is chilling about that scene isn't the act itself exactly. It's how quickly Shane gets there. There isn't much agonizing. The calculation is made, the decision is executed, and Shane puts the discomfort in a place he doesn't have to look at very often. He shaves his head in the days after. He can't quite hold Otis's wife's gaze, but he functions. He keeps moving. He tells himself the story. That's the mechanism the show is examining. Not villainy for its own sake, but something far more recognizable. The way a person can construct a narrative about why they had no choice, and then keep adding chapters to cover each new decision, until the gap between who they believe themselves to be and what they have actually done has become too wide to cross back over. Rick figures it out eventually. Standing in the barn after Sophia walks out of it, that devastating end to the first half of season 2, he reads Shane's face in a particular way and understands what must have happened to Otis. And the relationship between them changes shape permanently. It's no longer two friends in an uncomfortable situation. It's two men who understand each other's values well enough to know they're heading toward a collision that only one of them will survive. Season 2, episode 12, Better Angels, is where it ends. Shane leads Rick out to a field with a gun and every intention of using it. Rick talks him down, or appears to. And then, in the moments when Shane lets himself believe it's over, Rick drives a knife into his chest. It's the most significant moment of character change in the early seasons. This quiet, terrible decision that Rick makes when he understands there is no other version of how this ends. It isn't a dramatic fight. It's a conversation that ends with a knife. Carl shoots Shane when he turns, and the look on Rick's face in that moment is something the show gives full credit to. Grief. Genuine grief for his best friend who tried to kill him. Both things at once unresolved. Rick isn't relieved, he's wrecked. That quality of the scene, the refusal to let Rick feel clean about it, is part of what makes Shane's death so much more affecting than a straightforward villain getting what he deserved. Shane wasn't a straightforward villain. He was someone who looked at the world they were living in and made the decision that the moral accounting he'd been doing his whole life was a system the situation could no longer afford. The thing worth carrying forward is the mechanism, because it doesn't require an apocalypse. The story Shane tells himself to make peace with Otis, necessity, survival, no other option, is a version of a story that people tell themselves in much smaller situations every day. The progressive compromise, each decision that works confirming the logic of the one before it. The line moving not all at once but gradually, step by step, in a direction you'd never have agreed to at the start. The question always is, at what point does the story you're telling yourself stop being an explanation and start being a justification? Shane never found that point, not because he lacked the capacity to find it, but because the situation kept providing him with new reasons to keep walking in the direction he was already heading. Rick names his daughter Judith. He does it quietly, without ceremony, in the middle of everything falling apart. It's a small thing, but the naming of a child is never entirely a small thing, and the show treats it as a moment of continuation, a signal that the people who shape this group and this story remain part of it even in their absence. Shane is part of that story. However it ended, he is woven into it. The show never lets you forget that. There's an episode in season 1 that does a lot of quiet work setting up everything Shane eventually becomes, and it's worth mentioning here because it's easy to overlook in the context of what comes later. TS-19, the CDC episode, is where the group shelters in the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta and meets Jenna, the last remaining scientist, who has been alone there for a very long time and has reached the end of what he's willing to endure. He locks the doors. He tells them the building will self-destruct. Some of the group are in various states of grief and exhaustion, and some of them are prepared to accept the ending as something peaceful. Shane is not. Shane smashes through the glass with a fire extinguisher and gets them out. Frightening and loud and completely effective, and what I keep thinking about in the context of his later arc is this: the willingness to break things, when breaking things is necessary, is a quality, not a flaw. Shane has it in abundance. Rick has it too, in different measure. The question the show keeps asking is always what gets broken and on whose behalf. At the CDC, Shane breaks a window to save the people he loves. 2 seasons later, he breaks something else entirely. The quality is the same. The direction of it is different. That really is the whole thing with Shane. Daryl Dixon was almost cut from The Walking Dead before season 1 ever aired. I find this genuinely difficult to get my head around whenever I think about it, because Daryl is, and I don't think this is a controversial thing to say, one of the most beloved characters in the history of the medium. Norman Reedus wasn't originally part of the show's plan. The character of Merle was brought in first, and Daryl was added as Merle's brother, almost as an afterthought. A practical decision by Frank Darabont and the writers to give Merle a reason to exist in the story beyond the first episode. They nearly didn't do it. And if they hadn't, the whole shape of everything that followed would have been different in ways that are genuinely hard to calculate. Part of what makes Daryl so interesting as a character study is that his arc doesn't have a moment. There's no scene in which Daryl Dixon decides to become who he eventually becomes. No declaration, no revelation, no turning point you can point to and say, there, that's when it happened. He just keeps showing up. He keeps being reliable. He keeps protecting the people in his orbit quietly and without asking for acknowledgement. And at some point, the accumulated weight of those actions produces a person that the group depends on in ways that surprise everyone, including Daryl. Where he starts is worth establishing. He comes into the show as Merle's little brother, which is itself a way of saying defined entirely by someone else's identity. Merle is loud, aggressive, bigoted, and convinced that the apocalypse is a personal opportunity. Daryl has spent his whole life in Merle's wake, learning Merle's worldview, absorbing Merle's contempt for vulnerability, operating from the assumption that he is fundamentally less important and less worthy than the people he moves through the world alongside. He doesn't present himself as someone who deserves consideration. He acts as though consideration is a thing that other people get. The group doesn't agree. And it's not that they make a particular effort to include him. It's more that they just keep treating him as if his presence matters, and Daryl doesn't know how to argue with the evidence of consistent treatment. He's useful. His tracking skills, his crossbow, his knowledge of the forest and the road, and the group's need for his usefulness creates a kind of proximity that slowly becomes something else. Something that looks, from the outside, quite a lot like belonging. Beth Green sees this clearly before he does. Their conversation in Season 4, during the arc when they're moving through the prison aftermath together and hiding in an abandoned house, is one of the most interesting exchanges in the whole show. Beth tells Daryl that she thinks he used to be a nobody, not as an insult, as an observation. She means that before all of this, in the regular world, Daryl would have existed at the edge of things, overlooked, underestimated, categorized, and put away without much examination. She says it with such genuine conviction that it functions almost as a compliment, a way of saying that the world he came from had failed to see something that the world he lives in now has found genuinely necessary. Daryl doesn't know how to receive this. He deflects, as he almost always does when someone tries to hand him something good, but he doesn't disagree, which is itself a small thing and not a small thing. The relationship with Carol is a different kind of seeing. Two people who understood each other's damage without ever having to explain it out loud, which is a very specific form of intimacy that the show renders quite beautifully across many seasons. Carol came from an abusive marriage and had learned, over years, to make herself small and unobtrusive. Daryl had grown up in a household that taught him the same survival strategy. They recognized each other in the way that people who learned the same bad lessons sometimes recognize each other, not through discussion, but through behavior, through the specific way they held themselves, through what they didn't say. Season 3 brings the death of Merle, and I want to mention this specifically because Merle's death is not a simple moment of relief. Daryl finds his brother turned, eating someone's remains in a field, and he has to put him down. He doesn't. He can't. He breaks, standing in that field, weeping in a way we haven't seen from him before, and then he does it, not because he's okay, but because there is no alternative. This scene is important because it establishes something the show has been building quietly. Merle was the anchor for Daryl's old identity, and whatever Daryl has become in the time since the outbreak is its own thing, separate from that. Killing Merle isn't liberation exactly, it's just the formal acknowledgement of a transition that had already happened. Later seasons lean into Daryl as a leader, which the show handles with real care. He doesn't want the role. He's uncomfortable with authority in the formal sense, uncomfortable with the expectation that comes with being seen as the person in charge, because being seen is still something he has to work against his instincts to allow. But the group keeps looking to him. They keep needing him to make calls, and he keeps making them badly sometimes, with enormous reluctance always, but making them nonetheless. The life lesson in Daryl's arc is, I think, one of the quieter ones the show offers. It doesn't say anything so obvious as believe in yourself or let people in. What it shows instead is a process that takes years of small consistent actions, showing up, being reliable, protecting the people around him without asking for acknowledgement, and it shows how that process produces, over time, a particular kind of evidence. Not evidence that Daryl has decided he is worthy of a place at the table. Evidence that the people around him have already decided this, separately and without consulting each other, simply by watching what he does. Sometimes you don't find your way to self-knowledge through introspection. Sometimes you find it through the accumulation of other people's consistent responses to who you are. Daryl didn't decide to be someone worth trusting. He just kept being trustworthy, and eventually the gap between who he thought he was and who everyone else could already see closed of its own accord. That's a less exciting version of transformation than most stories offer, but it's more honest. And the show is, at its best, very interested in honesty. Since we're talking about Daryl's arc, the thing the show does with him in the middle seasons, particularly seasons 3 through 5, is worth paying attention to because it reveals something about how the show handles its most beloved characters. It doesn't protect him. It puts him in grief, real grief, and it lets the grief change him rather than resolving it quickly. Merle's death in season 3 does something to Daryl that lingers in a very specific way. It removes the justification for the armour. He kept himself defended all those seasons, partly because Merle's worldview was the air he'd breathed growing up, and Merle was still out there somewhere, proof that the worldview had some purchase on reality. When Merle is gone, when Daryl finds him and has to put him down, the thing he'd been defending himself against isn't quite as present anymore, which is freeing and very frightening simultaneously. His season 4 arc, wandering with Beth through burnt-out houses and arguments about hope, is where the show finds the version of Daryl that was always there underneath the crossbow and the gruffness, someone who is capable of enormous tenderness and has no idea what to do with it. He talks to Beth about his childhood, about Merle, about what his life would have looked like if the outbreak hadn't happened. He says something in those episodes that I find genuinely moving, which is that he thinks he was just nobody before all this. Not a self-deprecating aside, a considered assessment. He really believed it. The show has been quietly building the case against that assessment for 3 seasons, and he still hasn't made it. That's not a failure. That's an honest portrait of how long it actually takes to revise a deeply held belief about yourself, especially one that was installed early and reinforced consistently. Some beliefs take longer to shift than others. Daryl is still adding to the evidence pile in season 4, sitting in a wrecked house with Beth, telling her he thinks he was nobody before all this. He means it completely. The show has been proving him wrong for years. He's just not looking yet. Herschel Green keeps walkers in his barn. That detail introduced in season 2 is the thing most people remember as the source of the barn plotline. The slow-building tension of a community that doesn't know the dead are locked up 20 meters from where they're sleeping. And in the context of the storyline, it functions as a conflict. Rick's group operating on the knowledge that walkers need to be put down. Herschel operating on the belief that his neighbours and family members are still in some sense patients, waiting for a cure that he genuinely thinks is coming. It looks from the outside like denial, and the show lets it look like denial for long enough that you start to sympathise with Shane's position that the barn is an active threat and needs to be dealt with. The tension builds for weeks of episodes, and then one morning the barn doors are opened and the walkers come out, and eventually Sophia walks out too. Sophia, Carol's daughter, the child the group has been searching for through the entire first half of the season. And you understand that the show was never really interested in the barn as a security threat. It was interested in it as a question about faith, Herschel believes. Specifically, in this moment, he believes that science will find a way, and that the people inside that barn deserve the same care he has given every patient he has treated as a veterinarian and a man of faith his entire adult life. He is wrong about the cure. He is not wrong about the impulse. The show makes that distinction carefully. Here's a detail about Herschel that the show works in gently across season 2 and 3. He's a recovering alcoholic. He had a serious problem with drinking before the world changed. It cost him and his family a great deal. And he got sober through Alcoholics Anonymous. The philosophy of AA, which is very specifically structured around the idea that you cannot control everything, but you can choose how you behave in the next 24 hours, turns out to be an almost perfect framework for surviving a world with no long-term plans. One day at a time. Not because tomorrow isn't real, but because tomorrow isn't the thing you can act on. Today is. He's the person in the group who embodies that philosophy without ever announcing it. When everything falls apart, and in this show everything falls apart regularly, Herschel is the one who looks at what exists right now and asks what can be done with it. Not rescued, not fixed, not returned to some earlier state. done with. It's a meaningful distinction. Season 4's mid-season arc gives him his best material. A flu-like illness spreads through the prison population, killing people fast, and the group has to quarantine the infected in cell block D. Herschel, who is the closest thing they have to a medical professional, makes a decision that nobody asked him to make, and that Rick specifically tries to argue him out of. He goes into the infected cell block. He goes in with elderberry tea and small comforts and the determination to be present with the people who are dying, because that's what he thinks they need, and because nobody else is willing to do it. He gives Rick a speech about it that I find genuinely striking. The gist of it is that you can hole up and wait for the threat to pass, or you can go and face it knowing that it might take you down too, and the decision between those two options is where a person's character actually lives. He doesn't frame it as heroism, he frames it as obligation. He is, he says, old enough to have seen enough to know that doing nothing has costs just as doing something does. And he has decided which costs he's prepared to live with. He loses his leg to amputation in Season 3, a walker bite that Rick treats with a quick, brutal decision and a machete. And the show's handling of his adjustment to that is one of the small perfect things it does. He doesn't spiral, he doesn't have a crisis of identity. He assesses the situation, identifies what he can still do and what he'll need to modify, and gets on with it. Not because he's superhuman, but because he has a genuine and hard-won relationship with accepting the things he cannot change. The AA philosophy again. It's not coincidental that the show gave him that backstory. His death comes in the Season 4 mid-season finale, the episode called Too Far Gone. The governor arrives at the prison with a tank and a hostage. The hostage is Herschel. And the choice of Herschel as the governor's leverage, rather than Rick, rather than Michonne, rather than any of the fighters, is a deliberate one, both narratively and as a statement about what the governor understands about people. He takes the most decent person in Rick's group because he knows the decent person will cost Rick the most to lose. Herschel's response to the situation is, in its way, extraordinarily characteristic of who he is. He's kneeling in front of the governor's tank with his hands bound, and he smiles, yet not a performance. A genuine smile, small and private, aimed at Rick. Because he can see that Rick is trying to talk the governor down, trying to find the version of events where everyone survives, and he believes that's the right thing to attempt. He believes in it right up until the governor doesn't. The lesson Herschel offers isn't a lesson he ever teaches out loud. It's a lesson that comes from watching him consistently, over 3 seasons, choose to be present for the people around him in ways that cost him effort, and sometimes more than effort. He improves the air in whatever room he's standing in. That's the phrase that keeps coming to mind. He doesn't fix the world. Nobody in this show fixes the world. But the people who knew him were different for knowing him, and they carried what he was into the seasons that came after. That's not nothing. In the context of a show that is very honest about loss and very honest about impermanence, the argument that one person can improve the air in the room they're standing in is actually quite significant. You don't have to be the most powerful person in the story to matter to it. One more thing about Herschel, because it connects to the show's larger interest in what faith actually looks like when it's tested. His relationship with Rick across seasons 2 and 3 is one of the great pairings in the show, and it doesn't get talked about enough. Herschel is the person Rick goes to when the question isn't tactical. When Rick is trying to work out who he's supposed to be, Herschel is the person he has that conversation with. Not Shane, who will give him the efficient answer. Not Daryl, who will give him the loyal answer. Herschel, who will give him the honest one. There's a conversation in Season 3 at the prison during a relatively quiet moment, which are rare, where Herschel tells Rick something like, "You built this. You found these people, and you kept them alive, and you built them a place where they can try to have lives. You can let yourself be proud of that." Rick finds this almost impossible to receive. He's too busy cataloguing everything that went wrong, everything that might yet go wrong, every decision that cost something, and Herschel just sits with him and lets him do it, and then says the thing again, slightly differently. The people who are still here are here because of choices you made. That's Herschel as a function in the story. The person who insists on giving credit where it's due, even when the recipient is too burdened to take it. He does this for Rick, for Beth, for Maggie, for the people in the cell block who are frightened and dying of the flu. He shows up. He says the true thing. He improves the air in the room. Woodbury, when we first see it properly in season 3, is actually rather good. That's worth establishing clearly, because it's easy to process Woodbury entirely through the lens of what we eventually learn happens there. But when Andrea and Michonne stumble through its gates in the season opener, what they find is a functioning community. Real walls, electricity, hot food, medical care, people living something that resembles a normal life. Children. The governor moves through it with ease and confidence, knowing everyone's name, solving small problems before they become large ones, maintaining the appearance, and in some ways the reality, of a place that works. He didn't build it out of nothing. He built it through genuine competence, through the ability to make hard decisions during the first weeks of the outbreak, when most people were paralyzed, through the specific quality of charisma that convinces people in a crisis to follow someone. These are real qualities. They produced a real community. The governor was not pretending to be capable. He was capable. The arena is where it gets complicated. The arena is where Woodbury holds gladiatorial fights, survivors battling each other and walkers, surrounded by cheering crowds who have chosen to be there. This is not something the governor forces on his people. It's entertainment. It's something the community has decided it wants, and the governor has decided to provide. And the fact that both of those things are true simultaneously is the most honest thing the show does with Woodbury. The cruelty isn't imposed from outside. It comes from inside. The governor reads his people well enough to know what they'll accept if it's framed correctly. And then he provides exactly that. And the provision binds the community to him in ways that are genuinely difficult to disentangle. Philip Blake's backstory, his name before he became the governor, involves a daughter named Penny. Penny turned before the outbreak reached critical mass, or in its earliest stages, and Philip couldn't put her down. He kept her. In a room in Woodbury, behind a locked door, he kept his daughter in the form she'd become, restrained, deteriorating, still carrying the shape of the child he loved. The governor fed her, talked to her, maintained the pretense of a relationship with something that had no capacity for relationship anymore. This is clearly a grief that has not been processed in any healthy direction. It's grief that has been sealed in a room and kept alive in a way that prevents it from ever resolving, and when Michonne finds the room and kills Penny, ends the thing that had been Penny, destroys the ongoing illusion. The governor's response is not grief, it's rage, pure, personal, implacable rage. Because what Michonne has done is not just taken something from him. She has forced him to acknowledge that there was nothing there to take. The love was real. The object of the love was not. Season 3 and the first part of Season 4 trace the governor's attempt to take the prison from Rick's group, his failure, the destruction of Woodbury, and then something quite unexpected. 2 episodes in Season 4 that follow him alone, after everything has fallen apart, wandering through an empty world with nothing. These episodes, Live Bait and Deadweight, are genuinely good, and they're worth watching again if you haven't seen them recently. In Live Bait, he finds a family in an apartment building, an older woman, her daughter, and 2 grandchildren. He helps them. He's kind to the little girl. He starts to become, slowly and almost credibly, a different version of himself. Almost. The show is honest enough to show you exactly where and why it doesn't hold. He meets a man called Martinez, a former lieutenant from Woodbury, and moves into a camp of survivors, and within a few episodes, he has killed Martinez and taken command of the group. Not through any malicious intention exactly, but through the simple mechanics of his own psychology. Authority tends toward him, and he doesn't resist it. He can't. His identity is too thoroughly organized around being the man in charge for any other arrangement to feel sustainable. The lesson the governor offers is about the difference between someone who builds a community and someone who builds an audience. The distinction is real and it matters. A community has its own values and its own internal logic and its own capacity to function without its leader, because the leader's job is to serve the community's needs. An audience is organised around the performance of the leader. It exists to witness and affirm, and when the performance falters, the audience disperses. Woodbury is an audience. The governor knows instinctively what his people want to see. He delivers it, he curates it, and the moment his authority is questioned, genuinely questioned, not just tested, the community stops being a community and becomes a weapon. That's the tell. That's the thing to watch for. A leader whose response to challenge is to transform their community into an instrument of elimination has built something they own, not something they've nurtured. There's a moment in his final confrontation with Rick at the prison when he has clearly already decided how it ends, and he's delivering the speech that precedes that ending, and Rick is still trying to talk him down. Rick says something like, "We've all done terrible things, and we can all still come back from it," and the governor listens to this and then gives him Herschel's head, because the governor is not interested in coming back from anything. Coming back would require acknowledging that there was a line and that he crossed it, and the entire structure of his identity is built on the premise that there was no line, that every decision he has made was justified by necessity, and that necessity justifies everything. That particular form of self-protection has a very high cost, it turns out. The first time we see Carol Pelletier in season 1, she's doing laundry. She's quietly efficient, pleasant, clearly trying to make herself useful without drawing attention. Her husband Ed is nearby, loud and unpleasant, and Carol orbits him the way someone who has learned through experience to anticipate another person's anger orbits them, with careful distance, with awareness, with a performance of smallness designed to keep the temperature low. Ed dies in the Walker attack on the quarry camp in season 1. And Carol's response to his death is something the show handles carefully. She's not secretly relieved in an obvious way. She's grief-stricken, or performing grief-strickenness, in the complex register of someone who has spent years in a relationship that damaged her and has no clean feelings about its ending. The transformation that follows is not a linear progression. It doesn't start at a particular moment and move steadily in a particular direction. It accumulates through loss, through the specific education of surviving in a world that is consistently and brutally honest about what you need to be capable of. Sophia's death is a significant part of it. Sophia walking out of that barn after weeks of searching, the moment that ends Rick's last lingering faith in the old rules and shocks the group out of several misconceptions simultaneously, hits Carol in a particular way. Her daughter is gone. The person who Carol might have stayed soft for, who was the reason to hold on to gentleness, is gone. Season 3 introduces a Carol who has been paying attention. She's been watching the fights and the decisions and working out, quietly and without anyone noticing, what skills she needs. She starts teaching the prison children to use knives. She does this without anyone's permission, and she does it behind Rick's back, because she has already concluded that the adults in the group will object and the children will need the skills regardless of the adults' objections. She's right about this in the most uncomfortable possible way. Rick finds out and exiles her. Season 4, Episode 4, Indifference. He tells her she has to leave the prison because she killed 2 infected people to try to stop the flu from spreading, and the decision was not hers to make. Carol accepts this with a composure that is itself disturbing. Not because she suppressed her emotion, but because she genuinely understands Rick's reasoning and doesn't entirely disagree with it. She just made a different call. She reappears in Season 5, Episode 1, No Sanctuary, in one of the great moments of the early seasons. Rick's group is inside Terminus, captured, scheduled for slaughter, and Carol alone dismantles the entire compound. She has a map of the site. She knows which direction the shots will be coming from. She loads herself with weapons and firepower. She creates a breach in the perimeter by blowing up a gas tank, and she walks through the chaos she created and retrieves her people by herself. While everyone else is inside, trying to survive from moment to moment, Carol is outside, completely calm, executing a plan. This is the person she has become. No notes, and then the Alexandria arc. Carol arrives at Alexandria and immediately begins performing. She's not being genuinely warm and welcoming. She's constructing a version of herself that the community will accept and underestimate. She wears cardigans. She bakes cookies for the neighbours. She adopts the affect of an unremarkably pleasant middle-aged woman, finding her feet in a new community. It's one of the most impressive performances of the early middle seasons, and it would be fascinating if it weren't also quietly devastating. Because here's the thing about Carol's performances of normalcy. They require her to split herself in ways that have a cost. The person she actually is, capable and cold-eyed and entirely willing to do whatever needs to be done, exists in a different compartment from the person the community sees. She manages the distance. She maintains the performance. But she can't always get all the way back to the warm version, and the show is honest about that. Season 4's The Grove is the most extreme version of this problem. Travelling with Tyrese and the two young girls, Lizzie and Mika, Carol encounters a situation that demands something from her that is beyond any previous demand. Lizzie has killed Mika, not because of illness or accident, but because Lizzie has made a genuine philosophical decision about the nature of walkers that she wanted to demonstrate. The situation has no resolution except one, and Carol is the one who is capable of arriving at that resolution and following through. She tells Lizzie to look at the flowers. The phrase has become one of the most remembered lines in the show's run, and it's remembered because the show earns every gram of its weight. That scene is, I think, the best single scene the show produced, not for spectacle, but for the thing it asks of the actress and the character and the viewer simultaneously. Carol is capable of this because she became what the situation required. The cost of that capability is the scene itself. Ezekiel comes later. The king of the kingdom, with his tiger and his speeches, and his deliberate performance of authority, finds something in Carol that she's been refusing to let anyone find for quite a long time. He sees through the smallness she performs. He sees the person she actually is. And this is the thing that matters. Rather than finding it frightening or overwhelming or too much, he's simply delighted by it. He thinks she's remarkable, not in spite of what she's capable of, but including it. Carol chooses to feel something again. Slowly, carefully, with enormous resistance, she allows it. The show presents this not as a return to who she was before, because there is no return. It's something different. The decision to build something new in the space that loss and transformation have cleared. The question her arc poses is one of the more uncomfortable ones in the show. When you become who you needed to be in order to survive something difficult, when you change in ways that were necessary and are not reversible, is the person you became somebody you can live with? Can you find your way back to warmth when the temperature of the world changes? Carol's answer across many seasons is sometimes, with effort, in the right company. And talking a bit more about the Kingdom period, because I think Carol's time there is richer than it sometimes gets credit for. When she arrives in the Kingdom, she doesn't intend to stay. She wants to be alone. She has specifically and explicitly chosen solitude in the house she finds outside the settlement's walls, growing vegetables, existing at the edge of things. The Kingdom's people keep coming to her anyway. Ezekiel keeps coming, and what Carol does with his attention is interesting. She doesn't just tolerate it, she runs the same performance she ran in Alexandria. The pleasant, unthreatening, slightly dim neighbour who needs help from time to time. She deploys the smallness at him deliberately. He sees through it almost immediately. Not because he's exceptionally perceptive about people in general, but because he runs performances himself and he recognizes the craft. And what he does with that recognition is telling. He doesn't confront her about it or try to expose it. He just starts talking to her honestly, from behind his own performance, as one person who is maintaining a role to another person who is doing the same. It's one of the more elegant character dynamics in the show's later seasons. Two people who have become experts at not being known, choosing very deliberately to know each other. Carol's arc in the kingdom is ultimately about what it costs to be good at being alone. She's very good at it. She has made herself almost entirely self-sufficient, and Ezekiel just keeps showing up at her door anyway. Not arguing, not performing, just there. She finds this both maddening and eventually something she doesn't want to lose. That's Carol's version of allowing someone in this particular life, slowly, against her own better judgment, through the quiet accumulation of someone who simply refused to be kept at a distance. When Michonne first appears at the prison fence in Season 3, hooded, carrying a katana, leading two armless and jawless walkers on chains, the visual is striking enough that it's easy to spend your energy processing the image and miss the information the image is carrying. Here's what those walkers actually are. The show eventually tells you this. One of them was her boyfriend, Mike. The other was his friend Terry. They were the people she was with when the outbreak reached them. She kept them, turned and stripped of their capacity to bite, and she moves through herds of the dead with them because their presence and their scent provide camouflage. The walkers ignore her because she's flanked by two of their own. This is, practically speaking, an extremely effective survival strategy. It is also, if you think about it for a moment, a very specific and very terrible form of grief. She is surrounded at all times by the people she lost. She has turned them into tools. She has kept them close in the only way the world now permits, and she has found a way to transform what would be unbearable into something functional, which is a very human thing to do, and a very costly one. What Michonne was before the world changed, who she was, what she had, the show reveals slowly and partially across many seasons. She had a son named Andre, a very young boy. He died in the first days of the outbreak, in circumstances that the show handles with great care and relative quiet. The loss of Andre is the thing underneath everything else, the grief that has no flaw, that reorganized her entirely, that produced the specific version of isolation she practices when we first meet her. After Andre, after Mike and Terry, she chose solitude. Not just as practical strategy, but as something more comprehensive. She doesn't let people close. She spends significant time with Andrea after the fall of the camp, moving together through the woods, and even that companionship is held at a particular distance. She arrives at the prison with supplies for Rick's group as an act of practical generosity, not connection. She doesn't stay for the warmth. She can barely stand the warmth. The warmth is the dangerous thing. Carl is the one who gets through first. This is one of the more quietly beautiful things the show does, and it does it without making a large announcement of it. Carl is 12, grieving his own losses, processing things no child should have to process, and he and Michonne develop a friendship that doesn't follow the logic of most of the group's interactions. She seeks him out. She jokes with him. She does a very good bit with a pudding cup in Season 4 that tells you more about who she is when she's not on guard than almost any other moment in her early arc. She treats him as a real person whose inner life matters. In return, he lets her see parts of his grief that he doesn't show the adults, and she lets herself be present for it in a way that requires more from her than most things. The episode Clear, Season 3, Episode 12, is worth discussing here, even though it's primarily Morgan's episode, because what Michonne does in it is significant. She goes with Rick and Carl back to King County, Rick's hometown, to retrieve weapons from the police station. They find Morgan, and the episode spends most of its time with Rick and Morgan's reconnection. But Michonne, operating at the edge of the main storyline, does something small and important. She retrieves a cat figurine from a cafe, an ugly ceramic cat She brings it back and presents it to Carl because she knows he's been thinking about his mother, who had things like that. No explanation, no ceremony. Just the small act of someone who is paying attention. Rick notices. He tells Carl after, "She might be one of us." It's the highest compliment he gives anyone. She has earned it without seeking it, which is consistent with who she is. What Michonne embodies across the seasons before she allows herself to love Rick and build something with his family is a very particular and very honest picture of what happens when a person decides to make themselves unreachable. The armor works. She survives things that would break a less defended person. The walkers don't get her. The human threats she handles. She is, objectively, one of the most capable people in the show. But the show is careful to show what being unreachable costs as well. The moments of connection she allows herself, with Andrea, with Carl, with the small found family she eventually accepts, are almost painful to watch because they arrive against such obvious resistance. She has to work against her own protective instincts to let herself be present for another person. The grief that produced the armor is still active. It doesn't stop producing the impulse to withdraw just because she has decided to stay. The arc she describes over many seasons is not a recovery, exactly. It's more like a negotiation, a decision made over and over again that the exposure is worth it, that the people are worth the specific risk that people represent, which is the risk of losing them. She lost Andre. She kept going. She lost Mike and Terry in a different way. She kept going. The loss doesn't stop being the worst thing. The choice to stay open to connection despite it is just the choice she keeps making, one difficult morning at a time. Here's a fun detail that the show doesn't dwell on, but that's worth knowing. Michonne was a law school student before the outbreak. She was sharp and argumentative and entirely comfortable making a case in front of a room. The show gave her that background specifically to suggest that the person wielding the katana and moving through herds of the dead was never primarily an action character. She was always first a thinker. The katana was just the most efficient tool for the world she found herself in. Beth Green has a quiet arc in a loud show, and I think that quietness is part of why she doesn't always get the credit she deserves. The dramatic deaths, the big confrontations, the power plays, those are the things that tend to stick in the memory. Beth's story doesn't work on those terms. It works on much smaller ones, and I'd argue that's exactly what makes it worth paying close attention to. She comes into season 2 as Herschel's younger daughter, sweet, faith-oriented, clearly sheltered in ways that her sister Maggie is not. The show establishes early that she's singing at the farm sometimes, playing guitar in the evenings, maintaining the specific kind of gentleness that Herschel's faith community produced in her. It's easy, in the context of everything happening around her, to read her as simply the soft one. Season 2, Episode 11, Judge, Jury, Executioner, changes that register significantly. Beth attempts suicide. She has been watching the world and the people around her, and she has reached a point where the weight of what exists and what has been lost has become too much to simply hold in place. She survives. She makes a small cut on her wrist and her sister gets to her. And the conversation afterwards with Maggie is one of the more honest discussions of grief and purpose the show produces in its first 2 seasons. What Beth says to Maggie, in essence, is that she needed to make a choice, that not choosing felt worse than making the wrong choice, that she's okay now, not because the world has improved or because she has a reason she didn't have before, but because the act of choosing, of asserting some agency over her own story, gave her something to hold on to. I find this quietly radical, as things the show says go. Not that survival is simple, or that hope is easy, or that faith solves the problem. Just that choosing, even choosing badly, even choosing imperfectly, matters more than not choosing. Agency, even in tiny quantities, changes the experience of being alive. After that, there's a line Beth delivers in the prison, casual, almost throwaway, that has stayed with me. "I don't cry anymore." She says it without self-pity and without pride, as a statement of fact. She has adapted. She has made the adjustment. She's not suppressing grief. She has moved into a different relationship with it, one that allows her to function. It's the kind of thing that sounds like damage if you read it a certain way, and like resilience if you read it another way, and the show deliberately doesn't tell you which is correct. Season 4 gives her 2 episodes that are her best material. Still and Inmates, Daryl and Beth together, post-prison, hiding and moving and arguing about the right way to respond to everything that's happened. The Daryl section is rich, as I touched on earlier, but Beth's arc in those episodes deserves its own attention. She wants to find a drink. Her first actual drink. Not because she's in crisis, she isn't, she's quite clear-eyed, but because she wants to do one thing she has never done. One ordinary human thing, in the middle of an extraordinary situation. She wants to assert the presence of her ordinary self. They find a decayed country club. They find liquor, and then Beth makes a fire and burns the building down. She stands there watching it with a look that the show lets sit for a moment without comment. This is what catharsis looks like when it isn't tidy. A person standing in front of flames, deciding that it counts as something. Deciding that the act of choosing to set this particular thing alight is a form of agency, even if the thing being set alight is already ruined. Grady Memorial Hospital Season 5 is where Beth ends up, held in a functioning Atlanta hospital run by cops who have developed a very specific and very coercive system of indebtedness. Beth's arc there is about small resistances, quiet acts of care for the other patients, the gradual accumulation of information about the building, the choices she makes about who to protect and what to disclose. She doesn't survive the arc. She makes a decision at the end of it that is both completely in character and completely miscalculated, and it costs her everything. Her death is genuinely painful, not because it's spectacular. It isn't, but because the show had been building, in Beth's arc, an argument about the importance of small, persistent acts of hope. Not grand gestures, not battlefield heroics, just the decision, made every morning, to find something worth holding on to and to hold on to it. She was the show's argument for that idea, and her loss is the show acknowledging, honestly, that the people who embody that argument don't get a shield. The Walking Dead of the title has always meant the living as much as the dead. Beth, as long as she was walking through that world, was one of the most alive people in it. Not in spite of her gentleness, because of it. Morgan Jones is the first person Rick encounters after he wakes up. We've talked about the hospital, about Rick riding toward Atlanta, about the quarry camp and the reunion. But Morgan was before all of that. Morgan was the man who tied him to a bed and fed him and explained carefully and without hysteria what had happened while Rick was unconscious. Morgan was the first act of human kindness in the new world. He's also the person who, when Rick finds him again, 2 full seasons later, has become something almost unrecognizable. The episode Clear, Season 3, Episode 12, is one of the most formally bold things the show does. Rick, Michonne, and Carl go back to King County to get weapons, and they find it occupied. The streets are full of elaborate and extremely effective traps, spike pits, rope snares, a burning body used as bait. The architecture of someone who has been alone for a very long time, with nothing to do but turn their environment into a kill zone. And then Morgan appears at the top of a building, in camouflage and body armor, and nearly kills all of them before Carl shoots him in the vest. When he comes back to consciousness and Rick tells him who he is, Morgan genuinely doesn't remember him at first. It takes a moment. And then the scene does something that the show was good at in its best seasons. It gives the character the full weight of the time that has passed without trying to soften it or rush past it. Morgan isn't broken in a generic way. He's broken in a very specific way. He lost Dwayne, his son, because he couldn't shoot his wife when she turned. And then his turned wife eventually killed Dwayne. And Morgan has been living with that every single day in King County. In their house, writing on the walls in increasingly fragmented and obsessive script, turning the town into a fortress that keeps out everything, including any possibility of moving forward. He tells Rick something in that episode that functions almost as the thesis of everything that follows his arc. He says the world is a killing floor. He says that everyone turns, everyone dies, and the only thing to do is to be ready for it. His logic is completely consistent with his experience. He has tried everything else. Now he clears. The word clear, which becomes the episode's title, and a kind of mantra for Morgan, means exactly what it sounds like. Clear the streets, clear the threats, clear your mind of anything that might interfere with the mechanical efficiency of survival. It's a philosophy of almost total negation. Rick can't bring him along. Morgan isn't in a place where that's possible. They leave him with weapons and supplies and a map with the safe house marked on it. And Rick tells him that the settlement exists and Morgan can come there when he's ready. This is a gesture of faith that the show treats with complete seriousness. Rick makes no promises about the settlement's permanence. He just leaves the door open. Morgan isn't ready for years. When he does arrive, Season 5, Episode 1, he has changed. The agent of this change is a man named Eastman, a forensic psychiatrist Morgan encountered in the months between Clear and the present, who was living alone in a cabin in the woods with a goat named Tabitha, practicing Aikido, and who told Morgan, with complete calm and certainty, that all life is precious. Eastman's backstory is dark enough that his philosophy earns its weight. He encountered pure evil in his work, a psychopath who killed his family simply because he could, and he had the specific and individual opportunity to enact the revenge that would have been entirely understandable. He didn't. He made a different choice. The choice cost him the certainty of most conventional moral reasoning, because you can't simultaneously believe that all life is precious and believe that some lives deserve to be ended, and he chose the belief. He teaches Morgan Aikido, not as a fighting style in the conventional sense, but as a philosophy of redirecting rather than destroying, of using force minimally, and as a last resort, of treating every situation as something that might be resolved without a body at the end of it. Morgan takes this into Alexandria and into the Savior conflict and into Season 6, and for a while it looks like it might work. The problem is the wolf. Morgan captures one of the wolves, a genuinely dangerous and clearly not entirely functioning member of the group that attacks Alexandria, and instead of killing him, as everyone else decides must happen, Morgan locks him in a house and keeps him alive. He's operating on the principle that all life is precious and that this man can change. The wolf does change, or starts to, but in the process of attempting to help a hostage escape, the wolf is killed and the hostage is killed and several other people are killed, and it's very difficult to look at the sequence of events and say that Morgan's choice was not a contributing factor. This is the show being honest about the limits of a principle. Morgan isn't wrong that the wolf was capable of change. He isn't wrong that killing him would have ended something that didn't need to be ended, but he applied the principle rigidly, without accounting for the cost to the people around him who were not consulted, and those costs were paid by people who had not agreed to pay them. The later Morgan, Season 7 and 8, is someone who has crossed back over the line in the other direction. The pendulum swings hard. He kills, and kills efficiently, and the show watches him do it with the specific discomfort of someone watching a person use a skill they had hoped was behind them. The Morgan who trained with Eastman, who carried a staff rather than a gun, who made the genuine and difficult choice to believe that something other than violence was possible, that Morgan recedes. He ends up departing for the spin-off show, carrying the war inside him to a different geography. Morgan's arc is the show's most direct examination of whether it's possible to hold a moral framework in a world that will punish you for it. And the answer it arrives at is yes, but not rigidly. Not without accounting for context, not without accepting that a principle applied without judgment stops being a principle and becomes a way of not thinking. Eastman's all life is precious is beautiful, and it is also not a complete system for navigating a world where decisions about life happen at speed, under pressure, with incomplete information. The thing Morgan teaches you, perhaps without meaning to, is that the value of a principle is not measured by how consistently it can be applied. It's measured by whether holding it makes you more careful, more present, more attentive to the specific human weight of every decision. That's a harder version of it, less certain, more useful. Since we're talking about Eastman, and he deserves a bit more space because the show only gives him one episode and packs an extraordinary amount into it, the detail of his cabin deserves a moment. He lives alone with a goat named Tabitha and a garden and a training space, and there's a grave in the yard that the show eventually explains. The man who killed his family, the psychopath Eastman had the chance to kill, he kidnapped instead. He kept him in a cell in the cabin and starved him to death slowly. Eastman, the gentlest character the show introduces in its middle seasons, the man who teaches Morgan that all life is precious, he did this thing. He held a man captive and watched him die slowly. And then he buried him in the yard and named the grave and started practicing Aikido, because the revenge did nothing for him. Less than nothing. It gave him the outcome he had wanted and left him more alone in it than he had been before. The lesson he passes to Morgan is not the lesson of someone who has never been tested. It's the lesson of someone who has been tested in the worst possible way and discovered that the answer he reached for first was not the answer that helped. That's why the all life is precious philosophy carries weight in the show's context. It isn't naive goodness. It's the hard-won position of someone who knows exactly what the alternative produces. Let's talk about what it actually takes to build something worth living in. The Walking Dead spends seasons 6 and 7 examining 3 very different answers to this question and comparing them in ways that are sometimes direct and sometimes just implicit in the contrast. Alexandria, the hilltop, and the kingdom. 3 settlements, 3 philosophies, 3 different theories about what makes a community sustainable. Alexandria came first in terms of our introduction to it. A planned suburb north of Washington, D.C., with high walls, functioning infrastructure, electricity, and the specific kind of community that had been assembled by someone who understood logistics and procurement rather than human psychology. The congressman who built Alexandria, Deanna Monroe, was genuinely intelligent and genuinely committed to the idea of reconstruction. She had a plan. The plan was working in some respects, but the plan had a problem, which is that the safety of Alexandria's walls had been purchased at the cost of the community's understanding of the world outside those walls. The people of Alexandria had not earned their safety through experience. They had been maintained inside it, while the world beyond their fences did its worst to everyone else. When Rick's group arrives from outside, from seasons of exposure to exactly what the post-outbreak world actually is, the culture clash is immediate and significant. Rick's group looks to the Alexandrians like barely controlled violence. The Alexandrians look to Rick's group like people who are going to get everyone killed the first time the walls fail. Both assessments contain a truth. The show handles this tension without flattening it. The Alexandrians are not simply naive. Rick's group is not simply right. What's actually needed is integration, the skills and the knowledge of one group meeting the social infrastructure and the willingness to build of the other. And the show traces, over 2 seasons, what it takes to get there. The hilltop is a different problem. It has functional farming and modest fortifications and a leadership structure that has technically been working. Gregory has been running it long enough to have established the routines that keep it going. But Gregory is a specific kind of inadequate leader, competent at administration, genuinely poor at anything that requires courage or conviction. He negotiated the Hilltops arrangement with Negan because that was the skill set the moment initially required, and he has been renegotiating it in various ways ever since. And he is temperamentally incapable of the thing the community needs now, which is someone who will look at the arrangement and say, "This is not acceptable. and we are going to change it. Maggie becomes that person. Not immediately, the art takes time and earns the transition, but she is the leader the Hilltop needs in a way that Gregory fundamentally is not, and the show's quite clear-eyed about why. Gregory sees the Hilltop as a system he manages. Maggie sees it as a community she's responsible to. The difference in those two framings produces entirely different decisions under pressure. The Kingdom is the most interesting of the three, and honestly, I find it endlessly watchable as a piece of fiction. Ezekiel has built something that is genuinely effective and genuinely unusual. A settlement organised around performance, the king, the tiger, the medieval affectations, and the formal speech and the rituals of court. None of it is real in the literal sense. He's a former zookeeper and community theatre actor named Ezekiel Sutton, who decided in the first days of the outbreak that his people needed someone to believe in and that he was capable of providing that. So he provided it. Here's a fun detail. Shiva, the tiger, was an actual animal Ezekiel raised from a cub after finding her badly injured at the zoo where he worked. Their bond was real. When Shiva eventually dies in a genuinely devastating scene in Season 8, sacrificing herself to save Ezekiel from a herd of walkers, the grief of it is the grief of something actual being lost. Not a prop, not a symbol, but a living relationship between a man and an animal who had genuinely loved each other. What makes Ezekiel interesting is his self-awareness. He knows he's performing. He tells Carol this in one of the more striking early exchanges between them, because Carol performs things herself, and he recognizes the work of it, and he doesn't want to lie to her. He's the king because the role is what the people need, and he has grown into the role in ways that have made some of it real, and he holds both of those things at once. The performance became a covenant. The three communities survived the Saviour era, not because any of them individually had the strength to do it, but because they stopped competing philosophies and started supplementing each other. Alexandria's infrastructure and social organisation, the Hilltop's agricultural capacity, and the leadership that emerged from its most difficult season, the Kingdom's genuine loyalty, and Ezekiel's particular ability to hold a community's morale under pressure. The interdependence that emerges is earned, not assumed. These three groups don't become allies because alliances are a good idea in general. They become allies because they have been in the specific situations that demonstrated what they each couldn't survive alone. That's a different thing. Most alliances formed from good intentions fall apart under pressure. Alliances formed from shared experience of what the alternative looks like tend to hold longer. The lesson here is one that the show doesn't articulate, but demonstrates consistently. The communities that persist are the ones that develop the ability to recognize what they needed that they didn't have, and to find it in someone else, and to accept that finding it meant allowing genuine interdependence. Not coalition, not strategic partnership, genuine interdependence, with all the loss of control that implies. That's harder than it sounds. It requires each group to trust that the things it can't provide for itself will be provided by someone who doesn't share all of its values and all of its history and all of its ways of making sense of the world. It requires a tolerance for difference that communities under pressure don't naturally develop, because pressure usually produces the opposite: tightening of the circle, exclusion of the unfamiliar, reinforcement of the in-group over the out-group. The fact that these three groups managed it, with all the history and friction and genuine mistrust between them, is honestly one of the show's more understated achievements. Building something worth living in is harder than destroying what you don't want. The show is very clear about this. Destruction is fast and satisfying in the short term. Construction is slow and uncertain and full of friction. It requires the same people who are just trying to survive to simultaneously figure out how to organise a functioning society, which is a genuinely extraordinary ask. And the fact that the communities of The Walking Dead managed it, imperfectly and with enormous cost, is the quiet argument the show's making about what people are capable of when the situation is honest enough. A brief note on Deanna Monroe, the congresswoman who founded Alexandria, because she doesn't get enough credit and she's interesting in a very specific way. Deanna came to the project of community building with a set of skills that are genuinely valuable. She understood political organization, resource management, how to identify and deploy people's competencies. Alexandria, under her leadership, was, in several important respects, a functioning small town. Her instinct to record herself on camera, to document the settlement story as it unfolded, is one of the more quietly profound touches the show gives her. She understood she was doing something historically significant, and she wanted it witnessed. Her limitation is that she trusted the walls too much. Not in the physical sense. She understood the walls had to hold, but in the psychological sense. She designed Alexandria's culture around the assumption that the walls would hold, and that people inside them didn't need the specific adaptations that the world outside required. The result was a community that was civilized and orderly, and genuinely pleasant to live in, and almost entirely unprepared for what came over the wall in Season 6. Deanna's response to Rick's group arriving, her insistence on interviewing them, on understanding what skills they had, on integrating rather than excluding, is actually her at her best. She saw what they were, and she saw what Alexandria needed, and she tried to put those two things together. The tragedy is that she didn't entirely reckon with what the integration would cost the people she was asking to live inside safety after years outside it. You can't give people back the version of themselves they were before experience changed them. Deanna's Alexandria offered something real and struggled with the complexity of the people who most needed what it was offering. Negan arrives at the end of Season 6 in what is, candidly, one of the most effectively horrible sequences the show ever produced. He steps out of a line of trucks with a barbed wire-wrapped baseball bat, introduces himself and the bat, Lucille he says is her name, and then spends the first half of Season 7's premiere doing what he promised he would do, which is demonstrate very precisely and at length that the old rules of the world around the communities no longer apply. The mechanics of the Saviour's system aren't random, and they're not simple. Negan is extremely intelligent in a specific and important way. He understands that fear is most effective when it's theatrical, when it has a shape, a specific face, a set of rules that feel both absolute and arbitrary. The tribute system he runs, in which communities surrender half of everything they produce, is structured that way on purpose. 50% is enough to be genuinely painful. It's also enough to leave the communities with something, which means they have an incentive to keep producing. A system that takes everything produces nothing. A system that takes half sustains itself indefinitely. The public demonstrations of power, the barbed wire bat, the arrival in formation, the performance of arrival at every community, serve a very specific function. Private violence produces fear in the person it's visited on. Public violence produces fear in everyone who witnesses it. Negan chooses public because public is more efficient. One demonstration, properly witnessed by enough people, does the work of many smaller private ones. He knows this. He built the system deliberately around this knowledge. What he doesn't fully account for is the gap between compliance and loyalty. Simon is the version of this problem made visible. Simon is Negan's lieutenant, efficient, effective, and considerably less controlled than Negan in his use of violence. When Negan sends the Saviors out to manage the communities in his absence, Simon interprets managing very differently than Negan does, because Simon has absorbed the output of the system, the fear, the compliance, the submission, without internalizing the input that produces it, which is Negan's specific judgment about how much violence is functional and how much tips over into something that produces enemies rather than subjects. Simon kills everyone at Oceanside. He's not authorized to do this, it's not what Negan wanted. But Simon is operating on the logic of the system as he understands it. which is that overwhelming force solves problems. He's following the letter of the philosophy while completely missing its spirit. This is exactly what happens when a system built on fear is administered by someone who doesn't understand why the particular calibration of fear matters. Season 8 is the season where the structure Negan built starts failing, and the failure is instructive. He has compliance. He has years of it. He has communities that have been showing up with their tribute and lowering their eyes and saying what they're supposed to say. What he doesn't have is genuine investment in his project's survival. The moment the communities have a real alternative, compliance converts to resistance with remarkable speed. There was no loyalty underneath the compliance. The compliance was always just the calculation that resistance was more dangerous than cooperation. And when that calculation changes, so does the behavior. There's a version of Negan's philosophy that is internally coherent. Create an iron rule that is consistent and predictable and follow through on it without exception. And the communities will accept it because acceptance is less costly than resistance, and the system will sustain itself through its own efficiency. It's not wrong exactly. It's incomplete. It doesn't account for what people do when they're given a reason to accept cost. The prison arc, season 9 onwards, is where the show asks what Negan is without the bat and without the structure. He ends up in a cell in Alexandria's jail, maintained as a prisoner, kept alive because Rick made a choice to spare him that cost Rick something, and Negan spends months or years in that cell, adjusting to what it means to be powerless. He talks to Judith. He tends a garden. He does small useful things in a context that doesn't require performance or management or the maintenance of dominance. What emerges is not a redemption in the simple sense. Negan doesn't become a good person. He becomes a more honest one. The systems he built required constant maintenance, the performance, the arrivals, the specific calibration of fear. And without that maintenance, he turns out to be a person who is capable of genuine connection and genuine honesty, neither of which were available to him when he was running the Saviors. The lesson his arc offers is about the difference between a person and the system they built. Negan built the Saviors around his own psychology, around his specific intelligence, his specific sense of theatrics, his specific tolerance for violence, and the system required him to be constantly present as a force rather than as a person. The compliance the system produced kept him from ever knowing whether anyone around him actually valued his presence or simply couldn't afford the cost of not appearing to value it. The people who follow Rick, who follow Michonne and Maggie and Daryl and eventually each other, follow through genuine investment. They argue with Rick. They disagree with decisions. They pull away and return. The relationship is live, friction-filled, sometimes very uncomfortable. That friction is the evidence of genuine loyalty. It only exists in a system where people are allowed to resist. Compliance and loyalty look exactly the same on the outside when everything is going well. They only reveal themselves as different things when something goes wrong, when the cost of staying becomes real, when the alternative is available. Negan's communities stayed with him as long as the alternative was sufficiently costly. Rick's people stayed even when the alternative looked attractive, because they had something invested in the outcome that the Saviors never had. The Saviors were employees. Rick's group was family. Those are not interchangeable things. Here's a detail about Negan that the show works in carefully and that reshapes the whole character if you let it land. Lucille was his wife's name. The bat wrapped in barbed wire that he named and carried and treated with the kind of care and ceremony that people usually reserve for living things was named after his wife, who died before the outbreak. He watched her die of cancer in a hospital in the old world. He was with her. He did not do a particularly good job of being the man she needed him to be during that period, and she died anyway, and the guilt of that joined the grief of losing her and turned into something that reorganized him. When the world ended, Negan was already carrying that. The barbed wire bat named Lucille, the weapon he is never without, The thing he talks to and about, as if it has a presence, is a grief object, a way of keeping her name in his mouth, in his hands, in the centre of everything. It doesn't redeem what he does with the bat, nothing does that, but it gives the character a dimension that the show eventually honours in an episode called Here's Negan, a season 10 extra episode that tells the whole backstory, and it's one of Jeffrey Dean Morgan's best pieces of work in the role. He is, in that episode, heartbreaking and recognisable in ways that the Saviour-era Negan is not. What the show ultimately argues through Negan, across all his seasons, is that people are more than the systems they build. The system he created was brutal and efficient and built to scale, and it has almost none of him in it. None of the grief, none of the guilt, none of the complicated person underneath the performance. He built something that worked, and it required him to disappear inside it. The cell in Alexandria is where very slowly and very painfully he reappears. Carl Grimes grows up on camera in front of millions of people in one of the most hostile environments fictional television has ever constructed. He starts as a child in season 1, wide-eyed and confused and clutching his father's hand, and across 8 seasons he becomes a young man who is, in a number of very specific and important ways, the moral conscience of the whole enterprise. This is not how the show initially presents him. The Carl of seasons 1 and 2 is largely processing what's happening around him. Too young to be the agent of anything, a person the story is happening to, rather than a person moving through it with purpose. Season 3 is when the show starts to make more interesting decisions. Carl, living at the prison, increasingly unsupervised, increasingly exposed to the worst the world can produce, starts making decisions that disturb Rick. He shoots a surrendering boy. He sits with the violence in ways that Rick finds troubling, not because the violence is gratuitous, but because Carl seems to be integrating it without the grief that Rick still carries about what the world has become. Season 7 gives Carl his best material, which arrives in the most unlikely form. He climbs into a savior truck and goes to the sanctuary to try to kill Negan. He fails, obviously, but what follows is extraordinary. Negan, confronted with this teenager who came to kill him and is not particularly repentant about it, doesn't punish him. He's genuinely interested in him. He takes Carl on a tour, he asks him questions, he engages with Carl as a person, with an inner life, rather than as an asset or a threat. The reason Negan does this, the show is careful about this, is that Carl represents something Negan doesn't often encounter, which is a person who operates on genuine conviction rather than calculation. Carl's attempt on Negan's life wasn't strategic. It wasn't part of a plan. It was a moral decision, clumsily executed, made by someone who decided that the situation required action and took it. Negan finds this remarkable, and he also finds it deeply threatening, because a community of people who act on conviction rather than calculation is much harder to manage than a community of people who calculate. Carl writes letters to the people he loves before he dies. He knows he's dying. The bite is unambiguous, the timeline is clear, he has time to say what he wants to say. He writes to Rick, he writes to Negan. Both letters exist in the show as statements of what Carl actually believed, which is that the version of the future worth fighting for is not one where Rick's enemies are defeated and destroyed. It's one where Rick's enemies are integrated, where the communities grow to include the people who are currently outside them, not because those people are safe, but because the alternative, a permanent war economy organised around the management of threats, is not a future worth having. Carl dies in Season 8, Episode 9, Honor. He and Rick and Michonne sit together in a candlelit basement while Rick reads Carl's letter, and the scene is given enormous space, enormous quiet. There's no dramatic score, no interruption, just the words and the room and the weight of what has been lost and what is being asked of the people left behind. Carl's argument to Rick, in the letter and in the conversation before he makes the choice to end things himself, is essentially this: I've seen what you can be when you're trying to build something rather than protect against something. I've seen you be a farmer, be a father, be someone who plants things and waits for them to grow. I need you to be that person again, not as a retreat from the world, but as the only version of engagement with it that produces something worth living in. Rick carries this, imperfectly, with enormous difficulty, through the rest of Season 8 and into Season 9. The time jump in Season 9 shows the communities 2 years on, functioning, growing, built in the shape of what Carl asked for: a blacksmith, a school, crops, infrastructure, the vision Carl articulated, made concrete by the people he left behind. Here's the thing about Carl's arc, and it's the thing that makes his death so much more affecting than the mechanics of it. The show uses Carl to make the argument that hope is not naive. This is important because the entire register of the show, the world it depicts, the violence it presents, the consistent willingness to show you the worst of what people do under pressure, tends to produce a kind of exhausted realism in the viewer. Things don't get better, people don't change, the systems reassert themselves. And then Carl, across multiple seasons, keeps quietly insisting that none of that is the whole truth, that the version of events where things improve is available, that it requires something different from what the world is currently asking everyone to be, but that doesn't make it impossible. He's 12 at the start, he's 16 when he dies. He does more in 4 years in terms of the argument he makes by living and the argument he makes in dying than most characters do across full arcs 3 times as long. No notes. Now, since we're talking about Carl, and I want to spend a moment on his relationship with Michonne, because I think it tells you something important about both of them that doesn't always get the attention it deserves. Michonne and Carl find each other in Season 3 and 4 in the specific way that people find each other when they're both carrying something too large for the normal vocabulary of the group around them. Rick can't always be present for Carl's grief, because Rick is managing his own enormous version of it. Daryl is present in a physical, protective sense, but not in the way that requires words. Carl, for long stretches of these seasons, is a child navigating adult-sized losses with very little direct support. Michonne gives him that support. She does it sideways, which is how she does most things. She doesn't sit him down and ask him how he's feeling. She finds what he actually needs, and she provides it without requiring him to ask for it. The comic book run he wants, the look on the photograph of his mother. She treats him as a person with an inner life that matters. And for a kid in Carl's position, that's not a small thing. And Carl, in return, is one of the first people to simply accept Michonne as she is without requiring her to be different or simpler or easier to be around. He doesn't treat her as frightening or unknowable. He treats her as a person. The reciprocity there, this teenager and this woman who has built herself into an island, is one of the show's genuinely lovely things, and it does quiet work in both of their arcs. She starts to allow herself to belong somewhere, because Carl shows her what belonging looks like from the inside when it isn't coercive. The Whisperers are introduced in Season 9 with a particular kind of reveal. The thing you assumed was a herd of walkers turns out not to be entirely walkers. Among the dead, moving through them, dressed in their skin, are people. People who have chosen, and it is a choice, to exist at the level of the pack, to set aside language and hierarchy and community and everything that distinguishes human social organisation from the behaviour of animals, and to live as close as possible to the dead who move through the world beneath any of those structures. Alpha built this. Alpha, played by Samantha Morton in a performance that is, genuinely, one of the finest things in the later seasons of the show, arrived at the Whisperer philosophy through a specific and documented route. She had a daughter named Lydia. She had a partner. The outbreak happened. And at some point in the chaos of the first days and weeks, something in Alpha broke in a direction that produced, over time, the Whisperers. The Whisperers' logic is internally consistent. This is important. Alpha is not irrational. She has looked at what happened to communities that tried to maintain human social structures in the post-outbreak world. The collapses, the betrayals, the violence that communities did to each other and to themselves. And she has made a conclusion. Civilization is not a solution. It's a vulnerability. The people who built walls and grew crops and formed alliances did all of that and still died. And what they died for was the maintenance of a structure that required enormous energy and produced fragile outcomes. Better to abandon the structure. Better to move with the dead, to use their camouflage, to reduce the requirements of survival to the irreducible minimum. She's right about some of it. Communities are fragile. Trust can be broken. The walls the living build do eventually fail. The attacks and the betrayals and the losses that Alpha has catalogued are real. The question is what you conclude from those facts. Alpha concludes, abandon attachment. Abandon the structures that make attachment possible. Become as simple as possible. The only hierarchy that matters is the hierarchy of the pack. Who is stronger, who leads, who follows. And every other consideration is weakness. Lydia is weakness. Negan, who infiltrates the Whisperers in the back half of Season 10, recognizes the system and what it costs. He calls it what it is, eventually, which is not freedom from weakness, but an institutionalization of cruelty as the only available social currency. Lydia has grown up inside this. Her arc is, in a different way from Carl's, the show's argument about what the next generation is for. She was raised to treat attachment as a trap, to perform toughness as the only acceptable mode of relating, to understand her relationship with her mother as an arrangement of power rather than love. When she reaches the hilltop and encounters Henry, a young man who treats her with straightforward kindness, her instinct is to test it, to find the cost, to locate the manipulation underneath the surface. It takes time for her to accept that there isn't one. Lydia's rejection of Alpha's philosophy is not dramatic. It's quiet and gradual and very convincing, and it matters because she provides the show's most direct counterargument to the Whisperer thesis. I was raised inside this system. I know it from the inside. And here is what it produces. It produces children who cannot accept kindness at face value. It produces people who have no map for relationships that aren't organised around dominance and submission. It produces a community that can survive but cannot, by its own design, build anything. Beta, Alpha's second, devoted to her with an intensity that has something complicated and unexamined underneath it, is the other side of this. His backstory, revealed in Season 10, involves a former life as a famous musician, an actor, someone who had a public self that he eventually decided was intolerable. He found the Whisperers and found Alpha and found a version of himself that didn't require the maintenance of that public self. He could be nobody. He could be anonymous in the herd. The relief of disappearing into the anonymous dead, of removing the self that was required to perform in the human world, was enormous. Beta's devotion to Alpha isn't ideological exactly, it's personal. He has organised his entire post-outbreak identity around her and her vision, and when that's gone, he doesn't reformulate, he doubles down. The ideology becomes the monument. Samantha Morton's Alpha is unsettling in the specific way that people who have arrived at a consistent philosophical position through genuine pain are unsettling. She's not performing cruelty. She has genuinely concluded that tenderness is the thing that costs you everything. She whispers to Daryl in one of their exchanges that she doesn't feel anything anymore, and she says it the way you'd say, I solved the problem. Look, I fixed it. The problem of loving people and losing them. I fixed it by removing the capacity to love. That's not a monster's logic. It's a grief strategy, fully evolved and completely sealed. Here's the thing, the show demonstrates quietly through the Whisperer War. The communities that survive it survive not because they matched the Whisperer's efficiency or adopted their logic, but because they maintained the things Alpha had decided were liabilities. They maintained attachment. They fought for each other personally, not strategically. They held funerals and named the dead, and refused to treat their losses as tactical problems. They suffered enormously, and they are still there. The Whisperers are almost perfectly adapted to one version of the world: individual survival, movement, the ability to go anywhere and need nothing. They're completely unadapted to any version of the world that requires something to be built and maintained over time. Alpha's system is a response to loss that prevents any future gain. It's brilliant in its way, and it produces nothing worth having. The world the communities are building, slowly, expensively, with constant threat and constant failure, is the answer to Alpha's question. Not a logical refutation. A demonstration. Here is what attachment produces over time. Here are the people who are still here. Here is what they've built for each other. That's the Whisperer War's actual outcome. Not the defeat of a threat, but the proof of an argument. There's a line that Carol says to Lydia somewhere in the season 10 period, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I want to make sure I'm not misquoting, but the gist of it is something like, "The pain doesn't go away. You just make room for it. You let the pain exist alongside everything else that you are." And Lydia, who has been taught her entire life that pain is the thing you have to remove, that the only way to survive is to stop feeling it. Lydia hears this and looks at Carol as though she has said something completely new, which for Lydia it is. The idea that you can carry the thing instead of having to amputate the capacity to feel it at all. That you don't have to become Alpha to survive Alpha's world. That's the show in miniature, really. The idea that the answer to loss is not to stop being losable, but to get better at carrying what's been lost, harder, more honest, and available to more people than the alternative. The last character I want to talk about tonight, and in some ways the one the show keeps returning to as its most direct engagement with the question of what you do after the worst thing happens, is Maggie Rhee. You know what happens. Season 7, Episode 1, "The Day Will Come When You Won't Be," is the episode that reveals who Negan killed in the Season 6 cliffhanger. He killed Abraham first, and then Glenn, both of them in the same night, for reasons that are each terrible and specific. Glenn, who has been in the show since Season 1, Episode 1, who is one of the most consistently decent characters the show produced, who found Maggie and made a family with her, and was going to be a father. Glenn dies on his knees in a field, while Maggie watches and can't stop it. The scene is brutal. Deliberately, carefully brutal, in a way that the show knew would be a profound risk with its audience. Some people found it too much. Some people still can't rewatch it. The show made the decision because it needed the weight of that loss to be real, needed the audience to understand what the following seasons were asking Maggie to carry, and it could not achieve that weight through implication. What comes immediately after the group is released and sent away is Maggie asking Rick to take the others away. She wants to stay. She has to stay. The baby she's carrying, Glenn's child, had been in crisis earlier in the episode, and she's still not stable, and the hilltop is the nearest place with medical help. But it's also more than that. She's asking Rick to take everyone away, because she knows in that moment that she is not someone who can be comforted, and that having people try to comfort her will require something from her that she doesn't have. Rick drives away. Maggie stands at the top of a hill in the dark, and the camera holds on her for a moment. No music, no other people, just the fact of what has happened and the person it happened to. Still upright, still carrying the weight of a child who is still alive inside her. That image, Maggie on the hill, alone, is one of the most important images in the show's later seasons, because it establishes the terms of everything that follows. She is not broken by Glenn's death. She is changed by it, profoundly, irreversibly changed. But the form the change takes is not collapse. It's something harder and more demanding, which is the decision to become the person the people around her need, in the place that Glenn loved, in a way that carries him forward, even though he can't be there to see it. The hilltop is where she goes, and the hilltop is where she becomes a leader. Not because she wanted the role, not because she was appointed to it through any formal process, but because Gregory couldn't, and the people needed someone who could, and Maggie was the person who showed up. She learns to manage the community's resources, she learns to handle negotiations, she learns to make the decisions that leaders in this world have to make, some of which are very difficult, and some of which she has to make, while still carrying everything she's lost. Her son is born. She names him Herschel, after her father, who was taken by the governor, whose loss she carries alongside Glenn's. The naming is an act of continuation, not forgetting, but incorporating, weaving the people she's lost into the person she's building her life around. Herschel Rhee, son of Glenn, grandson of a man who believed in hope, enough to keep walkers in a barn because he couldn't bring himself to stop believing a cure was coming. The Glenn that Maggie carries forward isn't a simple thing. He was kind, he was resourceful, he was the person who ran supply runs through Atlanta when nobody else wanted to go, and who did it with a lightness and a competence that made the danger look almost manageable. He was the pizza delivery driver who became one of the most trusted and valued people in the group, not through any particular transformation, but simply through consistently being reliable and decent and genuinely happy to help. The show never forgot where he came from. It kept him connected to the ordinary world in ways that made his presence feel real and his absence feel specifically devastating. Maggie's later arcs, including in the spin-off Dead City, where she and Negan navigate a genuinely complicated set of dealings in a Manhattan overrun with walkers, involve the question of forgiveness in ways that the show handles carefully. She doesn't forgive Negan in the sense of releasing herself from the reality of what he did. She doesn't perform absolution because it would be useful or because the narrative requires it. What she does is more specific. She makes a series of decisions about what she can work with, what she can tolerate for the sake of outcomes she values, and where the line remains uncrossed. That's different from forgiveness. It's more pragmatic and more honest. The thing Maggie represents in the larger architecture of the show is the argument that grief and function are not mutually exclusive, that carrying something enormous doesn't mean you can't also carry everything else, that the weight of losing the people you love is real and permanent and doesn't get lighter with time exactly. It just becomes something you get stronger about holding. Not over, not past, through. She's still going. The show follows her forward into situations that require everything she has and a bit more. And she keeps showing up to them with the full weight of what she's lost and the full capacity for the life she's still building. That's not a story about healing in the clean sense. It's a story about continuation, about the specific decision that has to be made over and over again to be present for the next thing, even while you're still fully inside the grief of the last thing. Since we're talking about Glenn, and his role in the show deserves more than a mention within Maggie's arc, I want to spend a moment on what he actually was across 6 seasons before the show took him. Glenn Rhee arrives as the voice in the tank, young, quick, confident in the specific way that people who have developed competence in genuinely dangerous situations become confident, not arrogant, just clear about what he can do. He knows Atlanta. He's been running supplies through it since the early days of the outbreak, moving through the city alone, learning its walker patterns, finding the routes that work. He's done this for people he doesn't know particularly well, in a camp on the quarry, because he's good at it and because it seems to be useful. This is just who Glenn is. He does the useful thing. Across 6 seasons, he never really changes in this. He grows, he becomes more deliberate as a leader, more certain of his own judgment, more comfortable with the idea that his perspective has weight in a room. His relationship with Maggie gives him a home base, an anchor, something to measure decisions against. But the underlying quality, the willingness to do the difficult thing because it needs doing, the fundamental decency that stays constant from the voice in the tank to the end. And that consistency is actually quite unusual for the show. Most of the central characters change substantially. That's by design. The The show is interested in transformation and its costs. Glenn is the exception, and his function as an exception matters. He's the argument that you don't have to be transformed by terrible circumstances to be valuable inside them. That a person who brings the same careful decency to the apocalypse that they brought to a regular Tuesday has something the transformed people around them actually need. His death lands the way it does because the show has spent 6 seasons building his presence as a constant. He was always going to be there. He had survived everything. He had survived enough close calls that the audience had started to understand his survival as part of the show's internal logic. The removal of that certainty is not just grief, it's the removal of something the story had taught you to rely on. That's a very specific and very earned kind of devastation. That decision is, I think, the most ordinary heroism the show depicts. Not the Walker kills or the Fortress assault or the impossible last-minute rescues. Just Maggie Rhee, standing on a hill in the dark, still upright, still there, still choosing to be the person her people need. 11 seasons of The Walking Dead is, at the end of it, a very long argument that people are worth the trouble. Not an easy argument. The show earns the optimism it occasionally allows itself through hundreds of hours of demonstrating the opposite. The cost, the loss, the violence, the ways that people can fail each other when the pressure is high enough and the stakes are clear enough. It doesn't pretend the trouble is small, it shows you exactly how large the trouble is and then makes the case anyway. The zombies were always just the backdrop, the pressure that made the real story visible, as I said at the start. What the real story is about is what the people did with each other in the space between everything going wrong. The communities they built and lost and rebuilt. The identities they carried into impossible situations and the new ones they found on the other side. The grief they carried, the armour they built, the moments when they set the armour down and allowed themselves to be present for someone else. Rick waking up alone in a hospital to a world that had no more use for the structures that made his identity legible and choosing to move toward people anyway. Shane, who loved the same people Rick did and lost them in a different way. Daryl accumulating the evidence of belonging across years of small reliable actions. Herschel improving the air in every room he stood in right up to the end. The governor, who built a community out of an audience and called it the same thing. Carol, who became who she needed to be, and then slowly, carefully, chose to feel something again. Michonne, who set down her armour one relationship at a time. Beth, burning a ruined building and counting it as something. Morgan, carrying a philosophy that was too rigid until the world made him honest about it. The communities, learning to need each other properly. Negan building a system so efficient it had no soul. Carl, dying in the belief that there was a version of the future worth building. The Whisperers, who looked at the same evidence everyone else looked at and concluded that nothing could survive connection, and were wrong. Maggie, still there, still choosing. I'll have more Walking Dead to talk about. There's quite a lot of the spin-off universe worth getting into, and I have thoughts about what the later entries in the franchise do with all of this. Dead City and The Ones Who Live and Daryl Dixon in France are each doing interesting things with the characters and ideas we've covered tonight, and each of them deserves its own long evening at some point, but that's for another night. For now, wherever you are with this, whether you drifted off somewhere in the middle and the voice became just a kind of background warmth, or whether you're still here at the end of it, thank you for spending this time in this world. It's a good world to spend time in for all the horror in it, maybe because of the horror in it. Sleep well.